existed. So, for example, it zoned it did a survey of the city to see where whites and blacks lived. It was an explicitly racial survey. And areas that had whites in it were zoned for single-family homes only for future development. And areas that had African Americans in it were zoned for industrial use, and as you say, liquor stores were permitted, and so forth. And they created weird zones in order to implement this racial segregation. They had U-shaped areas in order to separate black from white neighborhoods if there was a concentration of whites in a certain area. And this was done throughout the 1920s and 30s and 40s even. And it created a segregated pattern in St. Louis that otherwise wouldn't have existed.
You talked about, I forget what city this was in, but in one case, putting a playground into an industrial area in order to make it sort of a draw for African-American families to move there.
I think this was St. Louis as well, yes.
Great, so the rise of single-family homes kind of plays a big role in this story of segregation. And so that brings us to the third piece of the puzzle here, which is homeownership, which is maybe the biggest. So can you first say what the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, was, why it was established, and what it did?
Yes, I think this is the biggest cause of racial segregation that we have today, the most powerful federal policy, and this was a policy, as you mentioned, of the Federal Housing Administration, which was another New Deal agency created in 1934. And initially, its purpose was simply to insure mortgages of families who had never bought homes before, first-time home buyers, and to insure their mortgages. And they developed the long-term mortgage. Before that time, anybody who had a mortgage, it was usually a 5 to 7 year mortgage, and there was no amortization involved, and so you had to pay off the loan in full at the end of the 5 or 7 year period, which just meant rolling over another loan. The Homeowners Loan Corporation, another New Deal agency, drew in about the same time, drew maps of every metropolitan area in the country. And in those maps, can I borrow your book for a second? Yeah. So this is the cover of my book, and the cover is a map that was drawn by the federal government of Newark, New Jersey. And there were maps like this in Oakland and in other metropolitan areas everywhere in the country. And the Homeowners Loan Corporation colored red any neighborhood where African Americans lived to indicate that no federal guarantees could be given for mortgages in those communities.
That's where we get the term redlining?
That's where we get the term redlining, and most people think that redlining was something that was done by banks or real estate agents, but in fact it was a program of the federal government. Well, that's how the Federal Housing Administration began, was by insuring loans for families, for homeowners who hadn't owned homes before, and it followed these maps so that very few homes were insured for African Americans. Mortgages were insured for African Americans. It was mostly a white program. And many people know about that, but what most people don't realize is that the Federal Housing Administration had a much more powerful policy to create segregation. And that is that the FHA recruited a large cadre of mass production builders to build suburbs in every metropolitan area in the country, to suburbanize the white population. It was explicitly a racial program to suburbanize the white population to move out of cities into single-family homes in the suburbs. And before that, you know, if you were going to have a single-family home, you typically bought some land and hired a builder to build a house, or maybe built it yourself. But there were no giant suburbs at that time. The most famous of these is probably on the East Coast, Levittown. You heard of that? But here on the West Coast as well, places like San Lorenzo Village, is it called? San Lorenzo Village. And San Leandro were all suburbs that were created by the federal.
Daly City as well, I think.
Daly, yes. Some of you may not remember a song that Pete Seeger used to sing. It was written by Malvina Reynolds about boxes on a hillside made of ticky-tacky, and they all look the same. That was a Federal Housing Administration development that was south of San Francisco. It's called Westlake and Daly City. So these were done all over the country. Someone like, well, the builder of Westlake was Henry Dolger. The builder of San Lorenzo was David Bohannon. Levitt built Levittown in New York. These builders could never, Levittown was 17,000 homes. Levitt could never have assembled the capital on his own to build 17,000 homes, buy the land and build 17,000 homes for which he had no buyers. Dolger couldn't do it in Westlake and Daly City. These were enormous undertakings, and the only way they could build these subdivisions was by going to the Federal Housing Administration, submitting their plans for the subdivision, including a commitment never to sell a home to an African American. This was an explicit federal requirement. The Federal Housing Administration even required these builders to put a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. And with these guarantees, then Levitt or Dolger or Bohannon could then go to a bank and get a loan, which was guaranteed by the FHA, to build the giant subdivisions. The homes were inexpensive. They were for working class families. They were for, later on, primarily for returning war veterans from World War II. They were inexpensive. They were 750 square feet homes, typically. These were very small, modest homes. They sold at the time for $8,000 or $9,000. Today's money, inflation adjusted, that's something less than $100,000. Any working class family, and there were many African Americans who were returning war veterans who had jobs in the post-war boom, not as good jobs as whites, but they still could afford to buy those homes. But they were prohibited from doing so by the Federal Housing Administration. The Federal Housing Administration had an underwriting manual. This was written. This was not simply a program of rogue bureaucrats. The underwriting manual specifically said that appraisers could only approve these applications of developers for loans to guarantee their subdivisions if the subdivision was for the same racial class. Not that there were any subdivisions built for the other racial class, but for the same racial class. And it said that the subdivisions couldn't even be approved if they were near African American neighborhoods because they ran the risk of, quote, infiltration by incompatible racial elements. And this was written in the underwriting manual, and I have quotations in it from in the book. In one case that I write about in the book, in Detroit, a developer wanted to build homes for white families, single-family homes, and the Federal Housing Administration thought that the development was too close to an African-American neighborhood, so it would run the risk of infiltration. So it required him to build a 6-foot-high concrete wall running half a mile long to separate his development from the nearby black neighborhood to avoid this infiltration. Can I tell one other story, or do you want to go on?
Well, I was
Okay,
going to
all
actually ask you what this meant for black homeowners or black families who were looking to buy homes.
All right, I won't tell my story, but that's okay.
Well, maybe it's a teaser.
Yeah, all right. No, well, this was a program, as I say, that was designed to suburbanize the white population, to get them move out of cities into single-family homes in the suburbs. African Americans, as you say, were denied that opportunity and remained renting in either public housing or in the private market. And I know if this is what you're leading towards, but the white families who bought those homes for $100,000 in today's money at that time, over the next couple of generations, as those homes appreciated in value, they gained $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 in equity. African-American families who were prohibited from participating in this program gained no such equity. The white families who moved into places like Levittown or Westlake and Daly City or San Lorenzo used that equity to send their children to college. They used it to weather emergencies. They used it to bequeath to their children so that they could have down payments for their own homes. Today, African American incomes, on average, are about 60%, 60% of white incomes, 3/5. And there's a federal story behind that as well, but we won't talk about that. But 3/5. African American wealth today is 10% of white wealth on average. And that enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 10% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the mid-20th century. And that wealth gap explains many of the social problems that we have in this country today.
Yeah, I think that's probably the most important statistic to take away from this book is that disparity in wealth, and should color how we think about policy solutions, which we'll get to in a second. But another thing I wanted to ask you about in terms of Black home ownership at the time were contract mortgages. Can you talk about what those were and what effect they had on Black homeowners?
Well, sure. Not only was the government suburbanizing the white population, but it was turning urban neighborhoods where African Americans lived into slums, because the African Americans, as I indicated, couldn't get federally insured mortgages. Banks wouldn't give mortgages to them if it didn't have federal insurance. And so African Americans were at the prey of speculators and landlords who would sell them homes on contract, which is another way of saying on the installment plan. And, you know, if you want to go buy something in a department store I guess nobody does that anymore, huh? This is the TechEquity. All right, you can't put something on layaway and buy it on the installment plan at Amazon.
Do that on Amazon?
I don't know.
think so.
Well, all right. For those of you who are youngsters, this is how poor people used to buy things. They would buy it on the installment plan. If they didn't make their payments, they would lose it and lose everything they had put into it. And this was the way housing was sold to African Americans, because they couldn't get federally insured mortgages even in African American neighborhoods.
Very high interest rates, too.
Very high interest rates, and as I just said, you accumulated no equity because it was simply an installment plan program where it's really like renting to own, except, yeah, it is renting to own, and you don't own it until you've made your last payment. And if you miss your next to the last payment, you can be evicted and lose everything you put into it. So as a result of this, African Americans in urban areas had much, much higher housing costs than whites had for similar housing. African Americans, even with similar jobs, were forced to subdivide their homes, to get renters, to double up with relatives. Neighborhoods became overcrowded because African Americans were prohibited from moving out into these federally subsidized suburbs. When they became overcrowded, they put a burden on social services and public services. Even if garbage collection, for example, was at the same rate in black neighborhoods as in white neighborhoods, because of the fact that the population was so much more dense in black neighborhoods, the same rate of garbage collection couldn't keep the places clean. So they became slums. And white families looked at these places and concluded that African Americans were slum dwellers. And when African Americans tried to move into white neighborhoods, it reinforced the fear of white families that it would turn their neighborhoods into slums, because they didn't realize that the slum conditions were the product of government policy, not of the characteristics of the people. And so this itself created white prejudice. It's certainly true that white prejudice influenced government policy, but government policy also created white prejudice.
So we're going to skip over the racial covenants piece because I want to save on time, but that's also an important part of the story here when it comes to the exclusionary suburbs.
Well, that's why I mentioned that. When I said that the federal government, the FHA, required developers like Levitt or Bohannon or Dolger to put clauses in their deeds prohibiting resale to African Americans, the common term for that is racial covenants.
Okay, and then, but there were also things like neighborhood associations and things like that who sort of enforced these policies and made neighbors sort of, part stakeholders in the contract between what would have been otherwise a homeowner and whoever he was selling to.
Yes, you've said it. Yeah, there are two types of racial covenants. One was what was attached to the deed of an individual home, and the other was a neighborhood association that would have a compact among all the residents of a neighborhood, which was legally enforceable, unconstitutionally legally enforceable, in which any homeowner in the neighborhood could sue to have an African American evicted if the African American moved into that neighborhood. And there were thousands of those successful suits that the courts enforced in the 20th century to have African Americans evicted from homes that they had bought legally, but in violation of these neighborhood compacts.
Okay, so let's fast forward to 1968, which turns out to be an important year in American history for lots of reasons, but not least because the Fair Housing Act was passed. I'm hoping you can talk about what it was, but more importantly, what its limits were and why segregation and inequality persisted despite the passage of the Fair Housing Act.
Sure, the Fair Housing Act, we're about, 9 days from its 50th anniversary, or 8 days, I think?
We're celebrating.
Yeah, the 50th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act. It prohibited discrimination in housing. It actually did nothing more than the 1866 law that I mentioned before. And, the Supreme Court issued its decision rejecting its 1883 decision that I talked about at the same time the Fair Housing Act was passed. And the Fair Housing Act did not have any meaningful enforcement provisions for another 20 years, and not until the 1988 amendments were there any enforcement provisions attached to the Fair Housing Act. So really, we should be waiting another 20 years before we celebrate the 50th anniversary of a meaningful Fair Housing Act. But all the Fair Housing Act did was prohibit discrimination in sale and rental of housing. It did nothing to undo the segregation that had been created by all these previous policies. So it's had some effect. In Levittown, for example, the suburb that was created as an all-white suburb in 1950 by the Federal Housing Administration, there's now an African-American population of, I think, about 2% as a result of the Fair Housing Act. But that's an area. It's in an area where the African-American population is 15%. So, I guess roughly speaking, the difference between 2% and 15% is the unremedied area of the Fair Housing Act, and that's the biggest part of it.
So, and then it also has ramifications, though, for other areas of our life, right? So how does this play as we move into talking about the present day? How has this persistent racial segregation played out in other social areas, education, criminal justice, public health?
Well, I think...
and your background is in education.
Yeah, I know nothing about housing. No, really, I don't. I don't. I got to this research that led to the book because I was an education policy analyst. I understood and wrote. I used to be the education columnist of the New York Times. I didn't know anything about housing. And I wrote many articles about the way in which social and economic disadvantages translated into lower achievement. I won't go into a long explanation, but for example, I'll give one example. We know that low-income African-American children have asthma at 4 times the rate of middle-class children. And if you have asthma, you're likely to be up at night, wheezing. You come to school drowsy, sleepless maybe, or absent more often. And I would explain that if you have 2 groups of children who are equal in every respect, except one group has asthma at a higher rate than the other, that group is inevitably going to have lower achievement simply because they're more drowsy in school. Even if they're equal in every other respect, we're not talking about the other problems they might have. And then I began to realize, and I'm a slow learner, so it took me a while, but I began to realize that if you take children with these kinds of disadvantages and you concentrate them in single schools so that every child in the class either has asthma or lead poisoning or stress from economic insecurity, or and all of these things directly translate into lower achievement, that the school can't possibly do well, despite the propaganda that was coming out from the federal government that the only problem that black children had in school was low teacher expectations and a lack of testing. And so I was arguing against that dominant model and understanding that schools where disadvantaged children were concentrated couldn't possibly succeed no matter how often you tested them. And I understood then that these schools, which we call segregated schools, and schools today are more segregated than they have been at any time in the last 45 years, that they're segregated because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. So I had to figure out how the neighborhoods became segregated, and that's
you went
that's
down
how I
the ultimate rabbit hole.
Right. So that's where this book came from.
How many links did you click through on Wikipedia before you decided you had to write a book about this?
I don't do this links business too well. I was lucky I had access to real libraries, which had real books, real journal articles.
Real books. That raises sort of an interesting topic, definitely a relevant topic for me, and I know many in this room, which is now we're starting to see a return of white people, and upper middle class people to cities and to communities that were sort of stripped away of all economic resiliency over the 20th century. We call that gentrification, and it's obviously an issue, and I think hard for many of us to grapple with, especially those of us who are drawn to live in places like Oakland. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on this sort of reversal of the trend of upper middle class or middle class white folks coming back to cities.
Well, you'll excuse me for disagreeing with you, but we're not beginning to see this. Gentrification is just a new name we've given to a process that was very common in the 20th century. We had a different term for it then. We called it urban renewal. And it's exactly the same thing. We have, for many years, had, populations are constantly being moved around. Urban renewal used to be called Negro removal. That was the term that was popularly used to describe urban renewal. And it was cities would demolish African-American neighborhoods and create middle-class housing or highway interchanges or hospitals or universities, and the African-American neighborhood would be displaced to a new segregated location. And that's the same thing that's happening now. It's not new. After the riots in Ferguson happened, people asked me, well, how did it happen to Ferguson, a suburb? We thought, blacks in St. Louis live in the city. How come they're living in a suburb like Ferguson? And I had to explain that they used to live in the city, but when the city of St. Louis embarked on an urban renewal program, they built the half of McDonald's sign to separate to show the entrance to the west. That was an African-American neighborhood. It was a vibrant African-American neighborhood before the half McDonald's sign was put up. And, they built universities and middle-class housing and so forth. And the African-Americans who were displaced had no place to go because the county of St. Louis was mostly closed to them for the reasons that we've described so far: exclusionary zoning, suburbs with restrictive covenants, and so forth. Suburbs that had been created by the FHA. And so the only place they could go was a couple of communities where there was rental housing and they would rent to African Americans. And one of them was Ferguson. The same thing's happening today with gentrification. As populations shift, as they always have, the displaced families are simply being displaced to new segregated communities or communities with concentrated minority populations like Antioch in this area. So it's history repeating itself. It's not a new phenomenon. And we have been powerless to enact policies that would protect the African-American residents of these neighborhoods, and increasingly Latino residents as well, from the gentrification or urban renewal policies, whichever you want to call them.
So let's get to policies then, and before we do, I just want to read a couple sentences here, which I was really struck by. actions of government and housing cannot be neutral about segregation. They will either exacerbate or reverse it. Without taking care to do otherwise, exacerbation is more likely. That's really, for us as an organization that is engaging in advocacy around policies to solve the housing crisis, very striking for me. And I know you were reticent to lay out any policy solutions in this book initially. I'm wondering if you could first say, before we talk about what some of those policy solutions should be, and actually some specific ones that are on the table in California right now, why were you hesitant?
Because I'm not a housing expert. I don't really know much about it. This is a book of history. And, it's been out for a year now, so I'm forced to learn more and more about housing. And I promise you in a little while I will become a housing expert, but the reason I didn't want to write much about it in the book was because I didn't know much about it, and I'm learning.
So you lay out, well, let's all learn together. You lay out some of the current policies that you say are insufficient, like the low-income housing tax credit, Section 8 housing. Can you just say quickly what those are, and then why you think that those current policies to sort of rectify the housing affordability crisis aren't enough?
Sure. We have three big federal programs in the housing area today. The biggest one, by far, by many, many times, the biggest housing program the federal government operates is a subsidy to single-family homeowners in mostly white suburbs, and that's the mortgage interest deduction. We spend more money on the mortgage interest deduction by far than we ever dream of spending on programs for housing for low-income families. But there are two programs that we operate for low-income families, and both of them reinforce or perpetuate or expand, intensify racial segregation. One you mentioned is the low-income housing tax credit. This is a program that's run out of the Treasury Department. The Treasury Department, the Federal Treasury Department, gives out tax credits to states, which then allocate them to developers of low-income housing. And the developers place almost all of their housing in already low-income segregated neighborhoods, reinforcing segregation. The reason they do it is because, there are a number of reasons. One is land is cheaper there, so they'd rather build in already segregated neighborhoods. Probably the biggest reason is that they don't have to have 55 community meetings explaining why they're doing it when they build low-income housing in an already low-income neighborhood. And it's also easy to rent because, you build a development, you put up a sign in the window, there are lots of potential renters who walk by, and you...
Sorry, yeah.
Huh?
I'm just trying to get her attention.
Oh, okay.
I'm trying to be subtle.
All right. And so it reinforces segregation. It exacerbates segregation by taking these developments and placing them in already low-income segregated neighborhoods. And that program could easily be reformed. I'm becoming a housing expert. That program could easily be reformed if we had the political will to do it. The main thing that would be needed to reform it is states need to, and also counties, need to change the priorities that they use in allocating these tax credits. They could place a priority, give, there are applications and there are points awarded for different parts of the application, and they could give more points to developers who are willing to build in high opportunity neighborhoods, not in already low income segregated neighborhoods. Section 8 is the same problem. The Section 8 housing voucher program, with which you're all familiar, I think, right? You know the Section 8 program? It's a subsidy to low-income families that enables them to rent apartments in the private market. It also reinforces and exacerbates segregation for a number of reasons. One is that and this does not apply to California, although enforcement is a problem in California, and that is in most places in the country, it's lawful to discriminate against Section 8 voucher holders. It's the only exception to the Fair Housing Act that prohibits housing discrimination, is you're allowed to discriminate against someone who has a Section 8 voucher. So you don't have to say you're not renting to you, I'm not renting to you because you're black. You can say I'm not renting to you because I don't like where your rent is coming from. And that is lawful in almost every place in the country. There are a few states that have prohibited that kind of discrimination, and California is one, but it's not well enforced. So that's one reason. And so landlords in middle-class communities won't rent to Section 8 voucher holders, even if they have apartments available and even if they're not allowed to discriminate. And another reason is that in many places, almost all places actually, the jurisdiction of the agency that administers the Section 8 voucher program, it's the Public Housing Agency, and it's not a metropolitan-wide agency. So the Public Housing Authority in, say, San Francisco can only issue a Section 8 voucher for use in San Francisco. It can't issue one for use in the suburbs.
Let me guess, a Section 8 voucher in San Francisco doesn't go very far.
No, it doesn't, but you can't use it outside in the metropolitan area. And another reason is that the amount of the voucher is calculated on the basis of the average rent or the median rent in the area of the voucher's jurisdiction. And you don't have to be a mathematical genius to figure out that the average rent is going to be too low to rent in a middle-class community, probably too high to rent in an already segregated community, and so landlords there can exploit the program by charging more than the market would otherwise require. So it reinforces segregation, and it would be so easy to fix. It would be so easy to fix this program. The Obama administration actually did come out with a rule that permitted but didn't require local housing authorities to give a higher voucher amount to families that rented in middle-class communities, high-opportunity communities, and a lower voucher amount to families that rented in an already segregated community. The Trump administration refused to enforce that rule. The civil rights groups went to court and got a lower court decision requiring them to enforce it because it was adopted with all the processes that are necessary to adopt a federal rule. It was supposed to begin being enforced under this district court decision on April 1st, which I think was 2 days ago. And so we have no evidence yet to see whether it's going to have any effect.
I have lots of faith in Ben Carson to do the right thing. So one specific policy that's on the table right now in California that gets at this, I guess it's in some ways an attempt to integrate the suburbs, or at least to hold the suburbs accountable for their exclusionary policies of the past. Maybe not hold them accountable, but force them to be accountable, is SB 827, which has actually met a lot of resistance. I'm wondering if you have, for those of you who don't know, SB 827 is proposed by Scott Wiener, and it would essentially permit housing, dense housing, within half a mile of a train station or a quarter mile of a high-frequency bus route. And this is an attempt to create density near public transit. But it is a broad brush policy that treats Orinda and Lafayette the same as Fruitvale and the Coliseum, for example. I'm wondering if you have thoughts on this policy and any ideas for how it might be made better.
Well, I'm again going to use "I'm not a housing expert" excuse,
yeah,
but
you're not allowed to use that cop-out anymore.
I think it's important to attack exclusionary zoning. We should prohibit exclusionary zoning everywhere. No suburb should be permitted to have a zoning ordinance that prohibits a mixture of types of housing, that where the entire suburb or all but a tiny corner of the suburb is restricted to single-family homes on large lot sizes, where townhouses are prohibited, where even low-rise apartments are prohibited. So SB 827 takes small areas around transit stops and prohibits exclusionary zoning, which is a terrific thing. It's a spear in the direction of exclusionary zoning, which is the primary way in which we continue to preserve segregation in this country. A lot of the advocates for low-income housing are opposed to it because their practice in the past has been to I mentioned earlier that the whole zoning process is one that's rife with exceptions. And what they like to do is have exclusionary zoning, but when the developer wants to build something, they bargain with the developer to set aside some units for low-income families in return for the right to build apartments that might be somewhat denser, but still for upper-income families in those neighborhoods. And so they get crumbs, I think, from these negotiated agreements, and they're afraid, with justification, that they won't be able to get those crumbs anymore, and the housing that's built around these transit stops will also be for higher income families, and so they'll be left with nothing. It's a reasonable fear. On the other hand, I don't know how far you can go in making an exception in this attack on exclusionary zoning for preserving low-income housing in an area around, or requiring these kinds of community benefit agreements in any development that goes on it. So it's a complicated issue. Personally, I think SB 827 has no chance of passing, because people who are, you know, the NIMBYs outnumber the YIMBYs in California. So I think that it has no chance of passing, and so I support it because it's a good way of starting a conversation about exclusionary zoning. But it is...
You don't have to worry about the consequences because you don't think it's going to pass.
The consequences are complicated. I think probably it would be a good thing if it passed. But I recognize that there's a price to be paid in these kinds of community benefit agreements that fair housing groups negotiate with developers.
And so before, this is the last question before we go to the audience, and I know there are probably a ton out there. If there is a case to be made for reparations, this is it. I'm wondering, you in the book don't like the word reparations. I think you term it, the word you like to use is remedies. Can you just talk a little bit about reparations? And if folks haven't read Ta-Nehisi Coates' article in The Atlantic from a few years ago called The Case for Reparations, it's a great follow-on piece to the book.
Sure, because I think we need something that's much broader than monetary payments to African American families. We just talked about one. You know, abolishing exclusionary zoning, prohibiting suburbs from preventing the construction of townhouses or single-family homes on small lot sizes that minority families could afford. That doesn't cost a thing. That's not you don't need a payment to do that. And so if we talk about reparations, which is thought of commonly as a payment to individuals, it wouldn't undo those policies, and as a result, you'd benefit the generation that got the payments and do nothing over the long term to desegregate the country. So we need a lot of different policies. Some of them would require payments. I'm not opposed to payments that are made to African Americans. One of the things I proposed in the book, you know, I talked about Levittown, for example, and the 13% gap in between a 2% African American population now in Levittown and the 15% that you would expect if it was representative of its broader community. Well, what I said was the federal government, to remedy this, if we had political will and an understanding of this history, the unconstitutional nature of Levittown segregation, if we understood this, we would support a program, and we're not going to do it now because it's completely politically unrealistic, but so is reparations. The federal government should buy up the next homes in Levittown up to a total of 13% for market prices of $500,000 a piece or whatever they are, and resell them to qualified African Americans for $100,000. This would be a narrowly targeted remedy for a very specific constitutional violation. And if we understood this history and had political support as Americans to enforce the Constitution, the courts would have to approve it. So I'm not opposed to spending money to remedy segregation, but I think it's too narrow to say that we can do it only by spending money. There are many policies that we should follow such as the changes I mentioned in the Section 8 program or in the low-income housing tax credit program, or abolishing exclusionary zoning, which won't cost a thing. In fact, some of them might save money. One of the things I propose in the book is that, and again, I'm not suggesting it is politically realistic right now, but one of the things I propose in the book is that we should withhold the mortgage interest deduction from homeowners in suburbs that refuse to desegregate.
I'd love to see the looks on their faces.
Yeah. Well, we could make it a relatively painless process by putting the withheld mortgage interest deductions in escrow and returning it to the families once they desegregated their communities.
That's a great idea. You've just identified TechEquity's next campaign idea. Thanks. Okay, audience, who's got questions? All right, I'll make my way back. Pass that down.
Good evening. First off, just thanks for your time and for coming. Okay, and thanks for your time and for coming. I have a state-sanctioned violence set of questions. In the book, you talk a lot about mob violence, about sheriffs watching mobs go into homes and burning them and looting them, and you also talk about even some sheriffs even participating in that. So if you could, I think, just educate us a little bit on that history is part number one.
Let's keep it to 2 parts max, because we got a lot of folks who want to.
My memory is short, so I might only remember the second part.
Part number 2, there's a lot of state-sanctioned violence that's happening right now. Whether you're in Sacramento with Stephon Clark, or here with Oscar Grant, or across the Bay, or across the country in New York. My question is, do you think, or is there a relationship between that past history of state-sanctioned violence and what happens today? So that's, so 1, history, 2, question. 3, we've already talked about policies a bit. But if you have any suggestions, feel free to shout them out. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, well, I've already forgotten the first one. I think I indicated before that we would not have the extent of state-sponsored or police violence against young African-American men if we weren't concentrating them in single neighborhoods where they had no access to the formal economy, no transportation to jobs, no participation in schools that were diverse. So they engage in behavior that attracts the attention of the police. We get into a cycle of violence where the police feel free to enforce order with violent policies. It wouldn't happen if we didn't have segregation. So I think that it's one of the prices we're paying for the residential segregation. The first question was, oh yeah, sure, now I do remember, yeah. Yeah, you know, this book and my argument is that we have an unconstitutional system of segregation. And it's unconstitutional because but for government action, we would not have the segregation that we have today. It's not an argument that there wasn't private prejudice. It's not an argument that many whites didn't like the policies that the government followed, but under our Constitution, the federal officials and state officials are required to ignore popular opinion and respect civil rights. So it's certainly there was mob violence there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, I'm not exaggerating. There were several hundred cases in Los Angeles alone in a 4-year period after World War II of mobs that attacked homes that African Americans had moved into in borderline areas when they tried to bust out of segregated, concentrated communities. Protected by the police, there were something, I forget, 400 or 300 cases in Los Angeles alone. The Los Angeles prosecutors couldn't identify a single perpetrator. There was only one person prosecuted, and that's because the state attorney general stepped in when the perpetrators were obvious and the city of Los Angeles claimed that they couldn't identify who had committed the violence. You know, I got started on this book, I told you, because of my interest in in education. I really got started on it in 2007 when the Supreme Court took up a decision of two school districts that tried to enact very modest school desegregation plan. I won't go into the details of it, but they were very modest in Louisville, Kentucky, and Seattle, Washington. And I remembered in Louisville, Kentucky, and the Supreme Court said they couldn't embark on the school desegregation plan because the schools were located in de facto segregated neighborhoods, which the government had no involvement in creating, and so you couldn't desegregate the schools as a result. And I remembered reading a case in Louisville, Kentucky, where a white homeowner had a friend who was an African-American Navy veteran, a middle-class guy with a good income. He wanted a better home for his family. Nobody would sell it to him. So the white homeowner bought another home in this suburb of Louisville and sold it to his African-American friend. And when the African-American family moved in, a mob surrounded the home. It threw rocks through the windows. It dynamited and firebombed the home. And when the riot was over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year sentence the white homeowner for sedition. And I said to myself, this doesn't sound to me much like de facto segregation. And that's how I got started on this research. So, but I'm not denying that the mob was there. This was, you know, I'm not denying that there was racial attitudes on the part of the white population. But the state of Kentucky should have been arresting the people who were surrounding the home, not prosecuting the white homeowner for selling a home to an African American. And had the state of Kentucky done that, that suburb would have become integrated.
Got our next question back here. It's on. Just talk into it.
Pull that up?
No.
Hello.
There you go.
Easy enough. First, I can't help but commenting that I suspect you have not thoroughly investigated and read 827 enough to know what a corporate boondoggle it is. But you don't need to go on from there. My real question is, you said in the 1883 decision...
You got to hold it up closer to your mouth.
The 1883 decision that invalidated the parts of the 1866 law that...
You've got to keep it up to your mouth.
That, I'll get there. I'll get there. It's funny because I'm always the one yelling, eat the microphone. I said on a board. The invalidated on the basis of the fact that it was not because of any overt racist reasons, but because it denied property owners the right to sell their homes, their property right. Am I got that right?
I was talking about I think that what I was talking about when I said that was the 1917 Buchanan decision, which invalidated racial zoning because it violated property rights. This was not the 1883 decision.
And that was a Supreme Court decision?
Yeah, both of them were Supreme Court decisions.
So my question is, because I'm always interested in the legalistics, is why that decision wasn't used to invalidate all of these property covenants, especially the ones when the post-war government decided to enforce covenants against people selling their property to black people.
Why? Because the Supreme Court has never been a defender of civil rights, particularly. You know, we got the Brown. Excuse me?
Why didn't Buchanan hold for that purpose?
It should have. It should have. But you know, there was a. You're old enough to have read about this. You know, there was a, not been there, but you know, there's a very famous cartoonist at the turn of the 20th century. His name was Peter Finley Dunn. And he had his cartoons, which were very popular in the country. They featured an Irishman at a bar, in an Irish bar, spouting off conventional wisdom. And his most famous aphorism was, the Supreme Court follows the election returns. And that was true then, and it's true now. And until today, until public opinion changes and we educate people about this history and build a new civil rights movement, the Supreme Court's not going to be on our side now either.
Well, there's no enforcement mechanism, right, on the Supreme Court. Someone's got to actually enforce the decision.
Well, that kind of leads into my question. You kind of touched on, I'm sorry.
I was sneaky with the mic handy.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time this evening. I appreciate you being here. That kind of segues. That kind of segues into my question. You kind of touched on the racial wealth gap and also the racial income gap. And so that being said, there's two schools of thought out there that exist. One is Black folks could just circumvent a lot of these issues if they could just pool their money together and overcome a lot of these atrocities. That's one school of thought, right? Like bootstrap, pull yourself up by your bootstrap. And or invest in Black politics. And so I'm just interested in
Invest in Black what?
politics, like become politically involved and change policy. And so I'm interested in knowing during your investigation, what do you think is the best path? Are the two interconnected? Can we just rise above these issues by, increasing our funds, pulling our funds together? Or should, is it going to take policy change to improve the lives of Black folks?
Yeah, I think it takes policy change, and I think any civil rights movement that's going to be successful is going to have to be an interracial civil rights movement. The segregation is an affront to all Americans. African Americans pay a bigger price for it, but it's an affront to every American who believes in the Constitution and in having a democratic society. And so the white population as well has to be persuaded, or at least not everyone, but a significant share of the white population has to be persuaded that change is necessary. It has to be an interracial civil rights movement, just like all civil rights victories have always been. African Americans simply don't have either the political power or the resources to enact change on their own. They certainly take a leadership position in civil rights movements, as they did in the 1960s when we had successful civil rights movements, but they couldn't do it alone then, and they can't do it alone now.
Okay, we got the next question back here. Yeah.
I just wanted to say that I owned a home in Crocker Highlands, and the racial covenant for my home did not even reference African Americans. It referenced Chinese. And so for exclusive neighborhoods, Crocker Highlands is wealthy folks from San Francisco in the 1900s, and I had plans from 1904. So it's been around for a long time. There is currently within California, the state has decided that it's going to circumvent some of the inertia of local communities who have not built enough affordable housing. And so I know you're not a housing expert.
Thank you.
I get this. But you've talked about, the focus on, the elimination of exclusionary housing. But there is really, particularly in the Bay Area, where a person making $200,000 can't really afford a lot of housing at this point, particularly if they want to own a home. In addition to exclusionary housing, getting rid of that, what else do you think will work? I mean, it's such a complex issue that, the top 2, 3, 4 things, and it's going to take a while. Some communities, like Berkeley, have only created 54 affordable housing units.
Well, and part of that is because of the zoning rules. We have a shortage of housing in the Bay Area, and maybe I'm saying something that's too subtle, but the only way to solve a shortage of housing is to build more housing, and the only way to build more housing is to go up. And and the zoning rules in much of the Bay Area prohibit density. Prop 827, SB 827 makes a small step in that direction by permitting density in areas near transit stops, which are currently zoned for single-family homes only. But it's got to go much beyond that. And I don't see any solution to the housing crisis in this area except to create more housing.
More affordable housing.
Well, if the supply increases, it'll become affordable. The reason that it's unaffordable is because there's a supply-demand imbalance.
Okay, that's a controversial statement. I know you're not a housing expert, but
Yeah.
yeah, it's on.
Hello? Yes.
on.
Okay. I too will acknowledge that you do not consider yourself a housing expert, but I will ask you to opine regardless. A lot of the historical, basis for a lot of the FHA decisions was predicated on this idea of home ownership as a part of the American dream. And I think as we get to where we are today and considering the limits and remedies, considering the implications on the wealth gap between those who own versus those who don't, and also taking in consideration the vast differential between the MID subsidy and other subsidies for renters, do you still consider housing ownership as a key to the wealth gap and overcoming that, or are you looking and thinking of other opportunities sort of outside the structural system that's embedded in home ownership as a better way or a more exciting or more innovative way of overcoming that race wealth gap?
Do you have a suggestion?
Well,
You might have something in mind. I'm serious when you say that.
I will say this. I work in real estate and I work in development, and I often work on the market side and have had history on the other side, sort of working on a more community development side. I think the shared appreciation and how we think of investing as a community is a really good start, but I also think there's a lot to do in terms of partnerships. I think the really interesting part about the history in the book that's very different. Like, we live in a post-Citizens United world where corporations and companies really have a vote in how we make policy decisions and how the world functions today. And so I think as we move forward, I would like us to think less of the historical structures that have created the problems and more around how do we actually bring everyone to the table and think of a new way of defining what wealth and success is. I just generally don't believe in, it's like the idea of you can play the same game. It's like, do you beat them at their own game, or do you just create a new game?
Well, I'm not sure I understand what you're getting at. You know, in this country, and I think it's unfortunate, but it's a reality, most families, except for the very wealthy, who have any wealth, gained it from the equity they have in their homes. We have no other mechanism of generating wealth for middle-class families except home equity. Our incomes aren't high enough to save substantially to generate wealth, and so it comes through home equity. So I was hoping you could tell me is what your suggestion is about an alternative way to generate wealth besides home equity.
Well, and can I also, we're going to have to move on. I can't come back to you just because there's so many people with their hands up, but can you say one thing about the sort of government's role in encouraging home ownership in the mid-20th century, which wasn't just about, you know, racism, but also about anti-communism?
Sure. The American dream is a fairly new phenomenon of owning your own home. And, you know, I was born in New York where, you know, people live in apartments and quite comfortably. It's not just poor people who live in apartments. And increasingly in other places, parts of the country like here. People live in apartments and don't generate wealth through home ownership. What Catherine was referring to is that the whole idea of moving white families into single-family homes in the suburbs began in 1918 when some geniuses in the Woodrow Wilson administration, after the Russian Revolution, decided the way to prevent white workers from becoming communists was to make them homeowners, because somebody who owned property couldn't become a communist. And no, seriously, and it was a very, throughout the 1920s, the federal government had a propaganda campaign to try to persuade white families to move into single-family homes in the suburbs. This was a federally created dream. It wasn't something that people had spontaneously. The federal government actually had community organizers that went around to cities and addressed white community groups to tell them that the way to avoid racial strife was to move to single-family homes in the suburbs. It was a racial program. After I published the book, I came across a poster in the archives of the Federal Housing Administration that the FHA had put out during World War II, in which it showed The poster was a picture of an African-American man being led away by police in handcuffs, and the headline was, "Escape crime, move to the suburbs." So this was a part of the federal government's racial campaign. It's true, it's become a dream subsequently, and I'm not saying the federal government was entirely responsible for it, but again, attitudes are not only, it's not just that policy comes from popular opinion, but popular opinion gets created by policy.
Okay, we've got another question back here.
I'm going to kind of double down on the same question, but maybe in a particular direction. So you've articulated how this culture of, say, an ownership society